This is a song I wrote called Slow Moving River, and it's about the river bonnet in Leitrim. Primroses blossoming under trees in the woodland, and kingfishers flashing by in a blue I can't describe. Birds singing loudly, excited by the springtime. Slow moving river, your banks have come alive, and the sunlight dapples on me through the green leaves in the treetops, and beech branches bow to you as you wander on by. Your cool, clear water washes over me, floating, and the soft cloud of insects hails the hazy summertime. Slow moving river, you are constantly changing, and yet there is something that's always the same. You go with the flow, and you don't think about it. Slow moving river, I could learn a lot from you. Well, there's a gold sun in autumn that lights up the hillside, as precious as memories that you gave to me. And all the leaves are dying, but no one is crying as you carry them gently down to the sea. Well, do you ever see the sun and wonder, what am I doing? Do you ever feel worried and blue? No, you go with the flow, and you don't think about it. Slow moving river, I could learn a lot from you. And your banks are so quiet now in the still of the winter, with icicles hanging down like fairy tale tears, and the circle is closing for another year, and you just keep moving onward, knowing spring will reappear. Oh, slow moving river, you are constantly changing, and yet there is something that's always the same. Oh, I could learn a lot from you. Oh, slow-moving river, I could learn a lot from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that beautiful song. Amy's going to be here all evening providing song and music for our event. Hello and welcome to Sligo Library online and live here in the library for our November edition of The Word. Tonight we have a special guest, Niamh Mulvey. Niamh is a writer from Kilkenny. Her first book, a short story collection called Hearts and Bones, Love Song for Leitrim, was published by Picador in June in 2022 and described as a highly accomplished and inventive by the Irish Times and astute, surprising and wholly entertaining by the Irish Independent. And I read it myself during the summer and it's a brilliant collection. Niamh will be in conversation with another amazing Niamh joining us tonight. Niamh Mac Cabe will be moderating, and she's an award-winning writer and visual artist based in Leitrim. She's published in literary journals and anthologies internationally. This conversation will be followed by our audience Q&A, which you're all welcome to take part in. We will then have our open mic evening this evening, which will be facilitated by Liv Andrea Banner, and will include Liv Andrea Banner, Mary Lavin, Bridget McMurrow, Roisin O'Shea. And Tony Keenan will be talking to us about a new publication called Scrimshaw. I'm now going to hand you over to the two fabulous Niamhs, Niamh Mulvey and Niamh Mac Cabe. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Welcome to the Niamh Hour. So Michelle introduced Niamh, but I'm going to say a few extra notes I have about Niamh. Niamh Mulvey, Kilkenny-born writer, has been living in London for the last 12 years, but she has just told me she's moved back to Ireland now, so we're very lucky to have her back amongst us. And she's published in many journals, Stinging Fly, Southword, Banshee. She's also written for the Irish Times and Image magazine. And she was shortlisted for the Sean of Whelan Prize in 2020. Her debut collection of 10 short stories, Hearts and Bones, was published by Picador in June of this year. And the stories, for the most part, are set in Ireland in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. So loads of great things have been said about Hearts and Bones. I'm going to say what books editor of the Irish Times, Martin Doyle, said. One of the best collections of the year, engaging storytelling, a mix of sharp observations, convincing and intriguing situations, leavened with idiosyncratic imagination. So that's pretty excellent, whatever it means, but it sounds good. And then Joseph O'Connor says about it, zinging with truth and wit, with pain and insight and joy. And I must say, I found that particular little blurb really, that's what I felt when I read the book. And Jan Carson says, these stories cut right to the very essence of what it means to be young. There's a beautiful cover. Now I have a proof, but Niamh has the book. It's a beautiful cover by an artist called Sarah Lavelle. And I was really taken by the cover. And we're not going to spend a long time about the cover, but just to mention it, it's a close-up of a young woman's face in shadow. And it's rendered with real detail and shows kind of the complex, intimate detail of her face. And I think that's a great connection with the visual of this book and what the book is about, because my reading of Niamh's stories is that they focus on small, delicate details of the individual in order maybe to address a wider story of our collective humanity. You can tell me if I'm wrong about that, Niamh.
No, thanks. Much better than I could have put it.
I read the book in 3 sittings. I could have read it in 1 because it reads so smoothly. But I read it in 3 sittings because it's divided up. It seems to be divided up into 3 segments, 3 stories, 4 stories, 3 stories. Is there a reason why you segmented it that way?
That actually was really late in the day. When I was at the very end of the process of writing the book, you know, I was getting it ready for publication, and the order, you know, was something I wanted to spend a lot of time thinking about, because one of the ways I was thinking about this book was I wanted it to feel a bit like an album, that hence the subtitle, Love Songs for Late Youth. So that is what I kept having in mind, as I was thinking, where should these stories come? So they don't at all follow the order in which they were written. I just wanted it to feel kind of elegant in the way they kind of spoke to each other, and I didn't want to have a really long one and then a really short one. All right, no, I did want that. I didn't want to have two really long ones after the other. I just wanted it to feel kind of, like whole in some way. And then I spent ages on it, but it was a really fun kind of part of the process because I'd done all the hard bits and I was all almost ready. And so I really allowed myself to enjoy that. And so I wrote the first and last sentence of every story on like big bits of paper, and I cut them up and I put them on the floor in my sitting room and kind of spread them out and move them around because I wanted to bring a kind of tactile element into the process because as you'll know, Niamh, like when you're writing it for a long time, it's all very, like, for most of us, we write on computers and it becomes very kind of abstract or something and very smooth. So I kind of wanted to bring more kind of, I'm always looking for ways to bring more texture into the process. That sounds really wanky, but
No, it's really
it's,
interesting.
and I like writing by hand, but my handwriting is terrible. But this didn't matter because I could read at the very least the first and last lines of every story. So I spent ages doing that, and I didn't want to have two stories in a row that had very similar protagonists, and actually it became quite hard to kind of make it as sort of smooth as I wanted to. And then I kind of noticed that in the way that I ultimately landed in terms of the order, the stories, they kind of felt like the first three were speaking to each other, maybe thematically or in their feeling, and then the middle four were a bit more unexpected and a bit more all over the place, and then the final three were kind of drawing together the themes of the whole thing. Like, this is all very much in my head. I don't expect anyone else really to pick up on that, but I just really wanted the whole process to have as much kind of joyfulness in it as possible, and this was a way for me at the very end to really kind of savor it, I guess.
It's really interesting to me that you wrote out the stories
Yeah.
in that way and had them on the ground in front of you. So you had this visual
Yeah.
pattern of how the stories are going to be read.
Yeah.
And that brings me to a question I was going to ask you much later, but I'm going to ask you now. You described this, well, your subtitle is Love Songs for Late Youth.
Yeah.
So love songs. And I know that you spoke in several interviews about how you tried to envision the stories as songs rather than
Yeah.
stories. And so this idea of them having a sound, or you felt like each one had its own sound, its own rhythm. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? It's very interesting.
Yeah. It was, the song thing was sort of almost like a mental trick I played on myself because I had been trying to write for a very long time. I've been trying to write novels and it just wasn't working. And I just stopped. I was like, okay, I'm not going to be a writer. That's fine. I'll do something else. And then one day I had this idea for a story. It's the story called First Time that's in the book, which is almost just a reminder to myself that it was the first one. And it just came really easily and really naturally. And when I wrote that story, I was like, oh, I think this is good. Like, what a surprise, and in a way that nothing else that I'd ever written, I really kind of felt that about. And then I remember I submitted it straight away somewhere, and immediately it got rejected. But I didn't care because I knew there was something in it. I was like, okay, that's fine. And then I wrote another one. And I never thought I would write a short story collection because they're famously difficult to write, So when I'd written a couple and they were coming in this really quite easy, kind of natural way, I really didn't, because I worked in the publishing industry for such a long time. And when you work in the industry, you kind of you get a bit over determined in the way you think of books. You start to think of them in the way that you would as someone who's trying to sell it rather than as someone who's trying to create it. So I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to kind of put too much pressure on myself to make something good or saleable or anything. I just wanted to just make little stories for their own sake. So in order to help me do that, I was like, okay, I'm going to think of them as songs, and I'm not trying to make any like amazing story or anything groundbreaking or whatever. I just want to capture, because they were kind of turning out to be about a relationship between two people. That was what was showing up in the stories, and the kind of intensity of feeling that existed between them. And so And that's often what you get in pop songs, you know. So like in a pop song, it's very often you. It's like, you know, that's the pronoun that's always in a pop song. Like you're the one. And I was thinking of that, looking at somebody looking at somebody else, but not being able to say what they thought. And that's the feeling of a great pop song. So I was like, okay, that's the feeling I'm going to try and tap into for each story. And by twisting my way of thinking, it made it possible for the stories to kind of come more easily. Because I would never make an album because I can't sing as beautifully as Amy does, or anyone. And that was such a beautiful song. And it's just I would never do that because it's just not in my skill set at all. So that meant I wasn't trying to be good or impressive. I was just trying to be true. And that's what kind of helped the stories kind of grow, I think.
Very good. I found reading them, and it flowed so easily, and that's why I was asking you about your sequencing, because you got it really right. But it flowed very easily, but yet you're dealing with quite complex issues, and there's a underlying tension throughout the entire book that I can't quite put my finger on. So I'm kind of looking at the sentences that are written, and there's no real threat, but yet there's this constant tension that just fills me with anxiety, as you know, like excitement and anxiety as I read it. And I think that's a real skill. And is that tension tangible to you as you're writing, or is that something that you're aware of after it's written?
I think, you know, when I'm writing the stories, I can only have one thing on my mind. Like I can't, I'm not thinking about like theme or even tension or anything except for what is this person feeling? What is that feeling going to make them do? And how is that going to impact on the other person in the story or in the scene? And if I can be really true to that, then everything else kind of will follow. And if it doesn't, it means that maybe there's just not enough there to carry the story. I think the very germ of the idea, I think that's quite mysterious. That's just sort of, I don't know where that comes from, but following through on it, I think that's what I learned to do through writing these stories, is how, I think in the past I would have ideas, but I wouldn't really know how to tap into them in the right way. But what I figured out in writing this book is just trying to, it was almost like removing myself from the process and just trying as hard as I could to think as that person and how they really felt, like honestly, and then what they did as a result of that feeling, and then kind of going from there. And because it's a story, it's always about something that's unresolved in some way, and then I think that's what lends it the tension, I think.
There is a real sense of honesty behind what you're writing, and the dialogue is always very authentic. It's quite sparse, but it's very authentic when it does happen. And so all of the characters are very believable. They're like contemporary takes on timeless and universal themes like motherhood, teenhood. I wrote down a few takes. Motherhood, teenhood, self-deception, disillusion of youth, but especially the themes of interpersonal relationships and the disconnection that is found therein. Am I right in my hot takes, by the way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So would you please read an excerpt from whatever story you'd like, Niamh? That'd be great.
I might read just the very beginning of the first story. I get kind of emotional about this story. My mother is here and she knows, even though this story is not about our relationship, but it's called Mother's Day. I was due to meet my mother in a gallery in the centre of town. I hadn't seen her in 5 years, and I hoped she would think that I looked better than she had expected. As I got ready, I noticed the ways my body was getting all worn. The skin on the insides of my elbow joints and around my eyes was starting to become thin and papery, like the wings of a moth or some other flimsy flying thing. But I didn't really mind, because it reminded me of her, of the age she had been when I had first known her. Although I flatter myself, of course, I was born to a 24-year-old, and I am now in my early 40s. A fresh wind blew in and shook the early blossoms off the trees in the garden, and everything in my house was beautiful and well made, and I saw it all with her eyes before I left to meet her. The children were at school, my husband was at work. It was a Tuesday. It was quiet on the street as I walked to the tube. It was mid-morning. I had a wonderful life that I had not earned, and everything we owned pointed to that fact. So I could not invite her to sit here among my things and drink coffee from the little cups we had bought in Istanbul 2 summers ago. It was her fault that I had so much. She taught me to think of myself as special, and so I found myself working on a fine arts magazine, passionate, broke, and ridiculously, embarrassingly pretty. I didn't know anything then about how money wraps itself around art. I didn't know that when a nice young man whose father was on the board fell for me, people would smile and nod in a way that shows that this was no surprise, that this was the way things were. I didn't know anything, and she didn't teach me. So it was all her fault, and it was my fault, and that's why things went the way they went, and that's why I hadn't seen her in 5 years. I found out I was pregnant again on the day I got the message from my mother asking me to meet her, and for a while I thought of it all as a gorgeous coincidence that lit the way towards a possible reconciliation. But when I saw her sitting in the cafe near the wing of the gallery that I remembered all too belatedly had been built by pharmaceutical blood money, I realized that this meeting was not about me or my body and its new life at all. It was about her and her body and its old, tired, ebbing life. And I felt irritated by the way she had shown me up already and again for being thoughtless, self-absorbed, and silly. She was sitting quietly in front of a scone and a cup of tea. Her hair seemed to be gone. She wore a scarf over her head. I sat down in front of her. She reached out her hands. I put mine over them. Her face showed the impact of illness, and I was momentarily unable to speak. "I need some of his money," she said, and I nodded. "I'm pregnant," I said, and she laughed. I smiled back, and she looked at me as if she were proud for one tiny second.
Wonderful. Thank you, Niamh. I love that story.
Thank you.
And the conflicting characters in it are written so skillfully that the reader can empathize with both. So you're sort of constantly, as a reader, you're constantly shifting between the two characters in terms of where you're laying your empathy. Are you conscious of avoiding bias when you're writing characters to make sure that the reader doesn't feel you're pushing them towards sympathizing with this character or that character?
No, I think it's funny. Like one interesting thing about that story was when it came out and it was published. A few people said what you just said about feeling like torn between the two characters in terms of your sympathy. But when I was writing it, I had no access in my mind to the mother, to the older character. I don't know, when I don't know now, I don't know what she thinks or what her story is or how she feels. The thing that gave me the power to write it was I just had this very strong feeling of what the daughter felt. And, and I know she's a very unsympathetic character. I kind of know that sort of, logically, and I also know because people have told me that. But for me, I just feel really sad for her because I just feel her feeling of this desire for a connection that, and spoiler alert, like it doesn't happen. So, but that's I really love when people tell me they feel bounced between the two perspectives, because that means the story is alive properly. Because if you just write something and it just means what it says and people just take it and they get what you mean and that's it, then that's not a story. That's just like propaganda. That's just surface. But if it's alive and real, it means people will have their own feelings about it, and that's the best thing. I think I love when people say that.
Well, despite the warring characters in that story, and in fact, in all of your stories, I think nearly all of them have a redemptive quality at the end. Sometimes very nuanced redemptive quality, sometimes very obvious. And in that story, like you say, there is no connection in the end between mother and daughter, but I found it very, very moving that they sat in silence together on the low wall. And then, it's almost like they're back to like the child and the mother, because the mother goes and buys the fizzy orange and the chicken sandwich from the supermarket shop to feed her daughter who's pregnant. And then the daughter just will sit down. And there's something really beautiful about that little act. So I think it's wonderful the way you can just put that tiny little note of hope at the end of the story without it becoming this big moral tale.
Yeah.
So are you aware, again, is that a conscious thing that you do with your stories? You set us all up with this tension and anxiety and interpersonal difficulties, and then add this kind of nice window at the end where maybe there is hope for us all.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think I'm quite an optimistic person, really. I think like stories, I think, are fundamentally about change, and change is very unpredictable and very interesting, and that's like change is like hope is change, right? Like that's what it is. It's a hope for something to change in your circumstances, for things to be better. Um, so so yeah, like I try to, yeah, they're not too bleak.
No. I note that a lot of the stories have several dominant characters working together or in direct conflict. When you're drafting the story, do you choose to have one central character that you're going to hinge the story around, or do they all work in a symbiotic kind of a way?
It's really hard because sometimes you'll have an idea and you'll have a character, but the idea runs out of road after a while. You kind of, it's just not feeling right, and that's very frustrating because you know there's something in the idea, but you just haven't found the right like vehicle for it yet. Maybe like there's a story in this book called Childcare, which is told from the point of view of a 10-year-old girl, and it's about her relationship with her grandmother and her mother. And the first draft of that story was, I think it had the three perspectives in it. It was the mother, the daughter, and the grandmother. And it sort of worked, like, you know, and when I sold the book to the publisher, that was the draft that was included, and they liked it. They didn't have any issue. But I kind of knew that it was almost a short story by numbers. Like there was this, then this happened, and this happened, and then ended. And it was like, yeah, it's fine. Like you couldn't really see what was wrong with it, but I knew there was something missing, and it was really bugging me. And it was really late in the day. Like I shouldn't have been making these kind of changes at that. But I just, okay, what if I just try? And I just tried it, and I can't remember what, but I just brought it back to the little girl, and I wrote it all from her point of view, and it was like, that was it. That was the way it was meant to be. Because, and I think then thinking about it later and trying to kind of theorize it a little bit, it was like, because she was the one to whom the most interesting change happened. The mother and the grandmother didn't actually really change at all, but the little girl did. And that was enough to carry the story. We didn't need their points of view because we could kind of tell enough about them from what she tells us. So sometimes it's just about, I know Claire Keegan, who's had her book out recently, she talks a lot about that. It's sometimes you have to try it from loads of different angles before you find before the right one kind of comes, you know.
That's what I was going to ask you. So is that something that you would commonly do? You just start drafting a story and then let the story tell you which character to chase rather than...
Yeah.
That's interesting, yeah. Would you please read some more
Sure, yeah.
for us, Niamh? Thanks.
Maybe since I mentioned that one, I might as well read a bit from that one. Find the page. Okay. Julia was 10 years old, and she yearned above all else to be grown up. It was tedious to be passed back and forth between people in the way that she was. It was frustrating to have no real understanding of why things had to be the way they were. She was surprised by the moral certainty her peers exhibited as to their place in the world. They always knew the best version of whatever game they were playing. They always had brothers or sisters or cousins who could back up their version of events. For Julia, life was unpredictable, grown-ups could do anything, and children had to follow along. But she doubted even this seesaw understanding of reality. If none of her friends saw things in this way, then who was she to say that she was right? Perhaps she was the cause of her own disorder. These feelings troubled her when she was with Denise, her mother, but when she was with Nan, her grandmother, she felt loose and happy and free. Nan drove her car too fast, smoked cigarettes half the way down, and ran a hair salon from her converted garage. She was long-limbed and lean, and always doing something or saying something. When she was with Nan, Julia forgot to worry, but this in itself was worrying. She felt she had no centre, or like she wasn't real somehow, because a real girl would be the same no matter the situation. I'll keep that one short.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm very interested in the epigraph that you start this
Oh, yeah.
by Anton Chekhov. Can you read it out to the audience,
Sure,
and then
yeah.
can you tell us why you chose that? I think
Yeah.
it's very intense.
Where is it? I missed her fearfully and could no longer deceive myself, and tried to get other people to deceive me.
Explain.
So who was it? It was somebody saw that and they were like, "Oh, you don't think much of yourself, do you?" Putting Chekhov. And I was
I
like,
think it's beautiful.
it's such a great line, yeah. So that is from a short story called My Life. It's quite long, actually. It's one of his longer ones, and it's just a phenomenal story. And it's about a young man living in a provincial Russian city in like at the end of the 19th century, and his dad is wealthy, and this young man is in his early 20s, and he feels guilty that he's privileged, so he kind of goes and tries to live with the common people, and obviously it all goes terribly wrong. And there's something really like contemporary about it. Like you could, I wonder, I really hope somebody like makes a contemporary film out of that, because you could plunge it into so many like modern settings and it would still work. But the end, it's all very, it's kind of all over the place, that story. I think if he were to write it now and submit it, some editor will be like, this is a mess, the narrative isn't tidy enough, but the ending is really, really moving. And I won't ruin it in case people do. I'd love people to read it. But I think in a lot of Chekhov there's this, it's about trying to see like more clearly, like that's what's in a lot of his work. And I think that's all we can really do as humans, because we're all in our own versions of reality. We're all what do they call it? The psychologists call it a controlled hallucination. What you see is not the same as what I see, etc. And there's something very, very lonely and alienating about that. And I think that is true, but then I think it is true that we can connect. And I think the ways when I think when we think about connection, it's actually what we're really doing is actually, what it means is that we're seeing in a different way, and we're seeing somebody else's way of seeing, maybe briefly or maybe just for a moment, or we're seeing what's really true in a different way. And so in that story about the little girl, it is a sad story because she's living in very sad circumstances. But at the end of the story, I think she sees her situation more clearly. And even though that is sad, I think it is also kind of hopeful, because she's got more of a grasp on what's really going on, and that can only be a good thing. Sorry, that was slightly waffly.
No, that's great. And she's also got her grandmother.
And she's got her grandmother.
Yeah,
Yeah.
another example
Yeah.
of that kind of hopeful note at the end. Like she sees things clearly, but Granny's by her side.
Yeah.
And that's actually another observation I had with the stories, is that there's usually 3 generations. There's a child, usually a daughter, but there's a child, a mother, and a grandmother. Nearly all of the stories in one form or another. Is that something you were consciously doing, or just something that happened?
It's definitely just something that happened, but I have to embarrass the 2 grandmothers in the room. My mother and my mother-in-law are here, and I think one of the interesting things about having children is that you see that having a child, is interesting in lots of ways. And one is that it's a relationship between you and the child, but also that it's a relationship between that child and lots of other people. And somebody who wasn't a grandmother is now a grandmother, and uncle and aunt, and that's just very interesting. It kind of brings this whole ripple of change into a life, into a family. And I think before I had children, I wasn't quite as aware of that. I think it gave me a bit more of a broader vision of how the world kind of operates, I think. And I think it's, a lot of women writers traditionally will talk about how motherhood is an obstacle to creativity, and I can certainly understand how that has been the case in the past. But for me, it was like the complete opposite, I think. It's just for that pure reason, is that I felt it gave me a better insight into just human relationships, and that's what I'm writing about. So, yeah.
So you have an interesting path to writing as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, Niamh, if you don't mind? Because you were working as a commissioning editor for many, many years in London.
Yeah.
And then you turned to writing. And I read a little bit about it. You have an interesting speak about that. So it'd be lovely to hear what you have to say.
Sure. Yeah. So I always did want to be a writer, but I wasn't very good. I needed to make money. So, it made kind of sense to go into publishing. And that was great. I worked there in London for about a decade, and it's very interesting, and it's a very different world to what I was used to. And I was trying to write while doing that job, but it's a very all-encompassing kind of job, because you're working when you're a commissioning editor in a publishing house. You're almost like the author's proxy in the publishing world. So you're advocating for them. You're fighting for their book. You get very, very emotionally invested in their success, and then you work with them on the creative side as well. You help them improve their manuscript. So it's just it just takes over your life. But in kind of a good way, because you learn a lot from it. And so I did that, and then after I had my second child, I was just a bit burnt out and sort of, a bit fed up of it, really. And I kind of felt like I was in a bit of a cul-de-sac with my career, and then also the writing. I had been trying to write this novel, and for years, and I had sent it out to these agents, and I knew it was really embarrassing. It's like I knew these people; they were like my friends, but they were still rejecting it, and it made it even more mortifying, And it was just like, oh, and I was like, oh, publishing's not working out, writing's not working out. I'm just gonna stop trying. And I had a real like career humiliation. Like I won't go into the details because it's really boring, but when it's just something really doesn't go your way in terms of like an interview and a job and stuff. And it was a real like kicker. And I was like, okay, that's it. I'm gonna like do something sensible and let go. And that was when these stories then started to sort of grow. And that was why I came up with this whole album and song idea, because I wanted to get out of that real kind of mindset of having to produce a book that would sell at London Book Fair and blah blah blah. I just want, like, who cares? I just make something real and true. And I think having I had to fail. I think I had to fail at writing other books to realize, oh, I still just want to do this just for its own sake, rather than because when you're in publishing, it's all about winning prizes or sales and blah blah blah. But I think, and I work with so many writers still, and I always tell them that I think in order to survive in that business, you have to have a really like solid boundary between your work and your art and your sacred bit and your writing, and then the kind of forward facing stuff, like doing events like this, and being polite to your publisher and doing but you have, and understanding the business part, because you do have to do that stuff. And that stuff can be great as well, but you also have to keep the work bit very, very kind of sacred, I think. And I didn't quite understand that until I reached that point, I think.
It's really interesting, Niamh, especially the way you describe that. The way you put it is that you felt like you had to fail,
Yeah.
or you had to let go
Mm-hmm.
before you were able to start writing.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting insight. Would you read another
I will,
excerpt
yeah.
for us, please? Thanks.
What will I read now? Trying to find a bit where there's no like bad words. Okay, I'm going to read the beginning of a story called The Doll. It's quite a long story, so I'll just find it. I know, you said to do the brother and sister, didn't you? Okay, this one's called Blackbirds. He loved to look after her. He saw it as his responsibility. He was small, yes, but she was smaller. Everything and everyone else towered over them. He knew how she felt like no one else could. Their mother saw that he took his responsibilities seriously, and she approved. They were let run wild. The house was big enough to roam through, and that was before you even got outside. They lived in the countryside near a lake. She wore his old clothes up until they were 10, 12 years old. It's only now that I'm reading this, I realise I think I had Sligo in my mind when I was writing, because it's set in I'm not from this part of the world, but my husband's family are. So yeah, that must be where it came from. The school in the village was the first place he felt that maybe he was different. He was frightened when he started, and then bored and hemmed in as he grew. She felt the same, 2 years behind him, and on the day she started junior infants, he was sad to see how she cried, but also relieved to see she had no time for any of this either. He wanted to get home where they could float sticks in potholes in the driveway and bounce pennies off milk gone rubbery in teacups under creaky beds in never-used rooms. Their mother didn't bother much with housework, and so the house softened around them, breathing and exhaling, rattling in the wind in winter, full of pools of sun and shadow in summer. When he went to other people's houses, his head would ring. The spaces were so small, and all he could feel in his nose was cleaning fluid and furniture polish. He was so happy to live where he lived with the people he lived with. He felt sorry for the other kids in their small, normal houses, other kids who didn't want to spend all their time with their brothers and sisters, other kids who wanted all the time to go to other places and to be with other people. Other kids with their mums who worked and their dads who worked, not like his mum who never worked and his dad who was retired now and more like a granddad than a dad, but that was fine by him. He didn't have any granddads, so his dad was like dad and granddad both. And he and his sister never had to worry about making a mess or being quiet. There was space and time enough for them to do pretty much as they pleased, and who cared if sometimes the house was cold because they couldn't afford to heat it, or that their TV was black and white and had only the 2 channels. He felt so lucky to have all of that. And it was puzzling, but also funny to him that no one seemed to see how lucky he was. When the other kids made fun of him for the holes in his jumper or not knowing who He-Man was, he just looked out the window towards home, the big house up the road and down the lane. A blackbird in the hawthorn in the spring. That's what she wrote about in her essay. He remembered that she was called up in front of the school to read it. It was just 1 page long, homework they had been given, and he, of course, had not even tried to do it. Their school was so small that when he was in 6th class and she in 4th, they were taught by the same teacher, and that was when he realised that not only was she better able to do all the school things than he was, but that she cared about all of the school things, and other people admired that she cared. Her plump, dimpled face, brown and freckly from all the time outside, flushed with delight as Mrs. Carson called her name. She won the English prize that year, and she told their daddy it was the first time someone in 4th class had won it. Their mam was so delighted she poured sherry into tiny dusty glasses, and they all drank some, just a thimble-sized amount for him and to her and her. To my little poet, their mother said by way of a toast, and their dad grinned and clapped. After that, it all changed. He went to secondary school, and the black clouds came in and didn't lift. It was an all-boys school. He was short and quiet and uninterested in team sports and lacked academic talent. He didn't know how important it was. His parents had forgotten to tell him. They seemed to think that all that mattered was getting on with your own business. They had forgotten to test his spellings, to do tables, and now it was too late. He was ashamed of his poor handwriting. He was impatient with chunks of prose. Numbers swam before him on the page. He was in the lower stream, which was full of boys from the town, boys who called him landlord because of his big house and his mam who had gone to university and talked different. Landlord's coming, they'd say, and they start banging the lids of their desks because they knew it drove him wild. He was frightened of loud noises. He could not cry, so he'd bark like a dog, and then howl, and then the teacher would come in and look at him with intense dislike, and he'd be sent to the head, and he'd sit there and look at the head, who looked back at him and said, "You've no excuse for this kind of carry-on, no excuse at all." And with her, it was just the opposite. She soared through the girls' school, and he heard it whispered more than once, more than twice, that it was good for her to be away from him, that she had her own friends now, that it was all much healthier. But they never stopped being kind to each other. They never fought. They still went on their long, quiet walks, and when he started smoking weed, she happily joined in, even though he knew she didn't really like it. It wasn't her style. She didn't like the way it made her mind bend, but he did, and that was the start of it. And in the dark tumult of the years that followed, it was only her who kept him breathing, who kept him alive, really. And even when he went through the phase, and it was a long, terrible phase, of blaming her for everything. If only she'd stayed on his side. Why did she have to go and be happy in the world? Why couldn't she have rejected it like he did? Why did she have to be such a success? A doctor, it turned out, a doctor like their mother's father had been. Even in those years, when he actually saw her, when she would come home and they'd walk down to the lake, he realised he couldn't hate her. When he was with her, all of the hatred and frustration that marked his days eased at least a little, but she never stayed very long. He heard her say once to a friend on the phone, when she thought no one could hear, that she couldn't bear it. It was too sad with Daddy getting on, and with Mam more dreamy and absent than ever, and the place so dirty, and with him. And she just said his name and stopped speaking, as if his name were enough, as if his name stood for all kinds of sadness and regret. He was numb and resigned to it all now, and it was the way it was. One day, after their dad had died, and he was rooting through some old boxes, looking for some tools, he found a stash of papers, and in the stash, which he had started looking through, thinking he might find a bank statement revealing some secret money, he found the Blackbird essay. And he read it, and was actually about two birds. He'd no recollection of there being two birds. And even though it was a silly, childish story, it amazed him how he had not recalled there had been two birds in it, one serious, the other a joker, and so he called her up, and they talked about it and laughed together as equals, for the first time in many years, perhaps the first time ever.
Thanks, Niamh. It's a really beautiful, touching story. And your very last story in the book, Hearts and Bones is the name of the story. Am I right in saying that you're working on a novel now, and that novel is based on Hearts and Bones, on that story? Can you talk a little bit about that? And
Yeah, it's quite hard to talk about it because my deadline is like 2 weeks' time, and it's not ready.
oh,
So I haven't like been able to look at this story for a while because it's like, oh God, it's going to be okay, I hope.
it'll be okay.
But yeah, so this story is quite a weird story, very intense, and you know, when I wrote it, I kind of realized. Actually, when I wrote it, when I wrote the first draft of the story, I didn't know that what I had actually written was the first draft of a novel, actually, because the first draft of the story is actually longer than the one that ended up in the book. And I was so caught up with the idea, and I wrote it as a story, and then I very quickly realized, oh, this is going to be a novel. And then the rest of it just sort of came to me in this mad vision. And I wrote like 10,000 words in a week. It was insane. And then, we sold the short stories and the novel to the publisher. And I came back then when I was, thinking about this as a collection and how to make it cohesive. And I went back to that story and I realized actually it doesn't really work as a short story. It was very much the beginning of this novel I ended up writing. So I had to kind of configure it and make it work on its own terms. So, if this novel never actually gets written, it would still stand on its own as a story, if you see what I mean. So that was a bit of a panic when I realized, oh, this needs more work. And again, it was quite late in the day, but I kind of brought it back to being about the two characters who are in it now, because before it was a bit more kind of, there was more of the other characters in it. It was a bit more sprawling. But yeah, like that sort of initial kind of energy and, being carried away with the idea. And now I'm 2 years later, just like, why does this like bit not work? And trying to like make sure the plot all fits together. People say that writing a short story is harder than writing a novel. Like, it's not. Writing a novel is really hard.
Yeah. Thank you for being so generous with all of your answers, Niamh. We're going to have a question and answer session with the audience shortly, but first we're going to have another song from the wonderful Amy O'Hara. So if Amy can join us, that'd be terrific. Thanks.
That was great. This is a song, it's a poem I put music to, and it's a poem that my grandmother wrote. Who knows the man I love? It is known to the blackbird, although I do not utter his dear name. It is sung boldly by them. Oh God, bring him noiselessly again to me at night in my dreams. Oh God, bring him noiselessly again to me at night in my dreams. I see in his eyes the blue light of all the starshine, and his voice is lovelier than the sweet breath of the flute. Come quickly, my dear heart, for comfort in my sorrows. Come quickly, my dear heart, for comfort in my sorrows. The freshest flowers will be cut for a pleasant garland of flowers, lilies for my best beloved, from heath and branches across the earth and the wave of the sea. Who knows whom I love? Across the earth and the wave of the sea. Who knows whom I love? Across the earth and the wave of the sea. Who knows whom I love? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amy. So we're going to take questions from the audience for Niamh. There's a microphone at the very back. Please don't all rush. Put your hand up if you have a question. Here we are.
So I'm quite surprised. Uh, I'm Levandria, by the way. Hi. The book is called Love Songs, but so far nothing has been traditionally a love between a man and a woman.
That's true.
And I think it's quite refreshing. And I wanted to know, how was your process in picking out other relationships that represent that kind of love and heartbreak?
It's a good question. Yeah, because you're right. The pop songs are usually about, quite traditional, romantic love. But I do, sounds really sappy, but I do think it was having children, to be honest. And it wasn't just that relationship that I have with them. It was very much that seeing that kind of broader picture of like, I kind of think of it as like almost like a refraction or something. And also I was very lucky in that period of my life when I had my kids. I was around a lot of other people who were also having kids. That, I lived in London, and you have these bits of London where everyone who has small kids ends up living, and you kind of see these relationships between people and their children, and then they tell you about their relationships with their mothers or their grandma, and it's all just really, it was just, I found it like a very interesting time in my life, to be honest. And I think yeah, it's like, I can't think, there's a kind of object, and that's tip of my tongue, but I can't think what it is. It's like a light. It's like, I kind of felt like, I think nowadays we kind of sometimes think about ourselves in very linear kind of ways, where in your own lane, pursuing your own goals, and that's what life is. But that's actually a really very recent way of thinking about life. For most of human existence, we're much more connected in a much broader kind of web, and that sounds a bit cliched, and there's a lot of downsides to that, and I'm really interested in the balance between how to live as an individual and also how to live in a community. I'm kind of really interested in that tension, and that's something that's there as well. Is that an answer? I feel like kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there, but thanks, that was a good question.
Thank you so much, Niamh. That was great. I actually, when I first read the collection, I was thinking for some reason, love songs for late youth. I automatically thought of the love song of Jennifer Prufrock,
really?
and that kind of loneliness and
Yeah.
looking. But I wanted to ask you, in the stories, I had this real sense of, and especially when you read from Blackbirds there, I was thinking so many of the stories seemed to be about trying to get back home, and the impossibility of it, or almost like a Hansel and Gretel, like that, trying to get back to a source place that you couldn't return to. And I think like Mother's Day at the end of that story is like such a profound, not being able to cross the river, or almost like a fairy tale element of that. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I don't know what to say, but yeah, I think I do. I think it's very something that we all know, that I think our early childhood echoes through our lives forever, and I think sometimes we can try and almost think about it in almost too much of a, what actually happened, what was the situation, and the past doesn't really bear that kind of scrutiny, and it can be so hard to really trace back any kind of origin. Like if you have a conflict in your life and you're trying to trace it back to something in your past, it is impossible, I think, because children are not small adults. Like they're different creatures. They think differently, but we were all once that creature, and I think there's something really sad and poignant in that. And when there's this bit in Mad Men where Don Draper says something about his daughter who's getting really into the Beatles, or getting into some teenage thing, in the 60s, and he says that teenagers are are so much more like nostalgic and obsessed with the past than adults are. And I remember thinking that was such a weird thing to say. And I think but then I think the reason it is that teenagers they're so much more connected to their child selves. So I think sometimes I think the reason that teenagers are so difficult and it's such a painful time is that they're almost like in mourning for this much more innocent time, because they're in touching distance, but it's gone. So again, I'm not sure if that answered the question, but there's some of the thoughts I was having while writing these stories.
I was wondering that, like, I'm really interested in the fact that it's sort of like transposing an album into prose, whether any of the stories have melodies for you, or if you associate them with actual existing pop or other songs.
No, not really. No, I'm not really that much of a musical person because I think some people do think really like that they can associate particular sounds. Like I really do. I love music and listen to a lot of music while I was writing these stories, but I wouldn't say I think about them as having a kind of literal oral kind of sound. I think of them. I definitely, when I was writing them, I think there was this like foundational sort of atmosphere, and that came from this feeling that between two characters, and that kind of came from them. So I guess the sound is probably more of a metaphor, maybe. But I think when I work with other writers, I often tell them that it's better to think of in your work trying to create a sound rather than like having a voice, because we always talk about voice in writing, and I think it's kind of unhelpful because it implies something kind of, you have to be chosen, you have to be kind of talented or special to have a voice. But actually, if you tell a writer you're just trying to create a sound, it's kind of, it makes it more playful and more almost like accessible, like anyone can make a sound, and so I think that's kind of what helped me write the stories, was thinking about it in that way.
When you wrote the stories, I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how you went and got was it at that point that you got an agent, and if you got a 2-book deal with Picador, or was it could you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, I had a bit of an unusual journey in some ways, because as I said, like I worked in the business, so I know a lot of agents, and I know a lot of publishers, and in some ways that makes it easier, because you kind of know the culture and how you're supposed to do things, but it can make it harder in some ways, and it's much more embarrassing when you're rejected, by someone that you know. And so I had been through the mill a few times. Like I'd written a couple of novels and sent them to friends who were agents, or sent them just to agents who weren't friends, but I did know them, because it's such a small world. Like everyone in publishing knows each other. It's like being Irish, being in publishing. It's like it's like small town, small world. But then with these stories, I published 1 or 2 things online around the time I was writing them. More kind of non-fiction-y sort of stuff, or almost like comment stuff to do with the industry, and that was getting a lot of attention. It was for totally unrelated to this book reasons, and so a couple of agents approached me and said, "Are you writing anything?" So I sent them the stories, the ones who did, and then a couple of people did offer then to represent me, and I was in, which was really nice, but I was in this position then of, do I go further? Do I try and go get the hottest agent in town and try get to Curtis Brown and all that stuff? And I didn't, because I sort of knew I wanted just to work with somebody who had a lot of like integrity and I could rely on, because I just know from the business it can be quite fickle and quite surface in some ways. It's a kind of show business, really. So I signed with someone that I knew really well for a long time, and I knew she was a very grounded, kind of solid type of person, which not all agents are. And then when we sent it out, short stories, like, they don't sell. Like, just for everyone in the room, when publishers publish them, they don't, and that's kind of great, because then as a short story writer, when they don't sell, you don't feel sad, because you had no expectation. So again, that kind of helped in the writing as well. I wasn't trying to write a novel that was going to sell for six figures and get movie rights and never have, it was just a pure kind of passion, love project. But the first thing every publisher says when an agent sends them a short story collection is, are they writing a novel? So I wasn't planning on writing a novel at all. I just wrote these stories. And then when Hearts and Bones suddenly kind of turned into a novel, when my agent sent out the stories, and everyone asked her, is there a novel? She had a good answer to that question. So then we did do a 2-book deal for the stories and the novel. And the novel was about 10,000 words at that point, all of which I've since deleted and rewritten.
So thank you very much for your questions, and I'd like to say thank you to Niamh for giving us such an incredible insight into your writing process and into the wider writing world. And how about a round of applause for Niamh?
Okay, I'm just going to introduce the open mic section of the evening. Liv Andrea Banner is going to moderate this now for us. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So we're gonna see five people up today. This one is me, and I would like to pay homage to a very special place in Denmark where I'm from. It was alive. The air was thick, and within it hung the unmistakable smell of alcohol. It was the usual, a thin beer, a cheap vodka, something sweet, maybe Baileys. It burned a little every time I breathed. I tried breathing through my nose, but it didn't matter. It burned. Sometimes it did feel like you could get drunk off the air alone. We called it Red Room, the official common room of my dormitory. Upon starting college, I was thrilled to know that my building was home to the official party lounge, but it quickly became a nuisance as sleep was nearly impossible. Some nights I had to surrender. I let my body be carried through the vibration of the music, from my bed, down the stairs, and through the doors. Beyond the smell of liquor was a sea of light and colors. The walls, painted in dark oxblood, had purple and orange string lights integrated. They gloomed between each other and created a warm pink shine. In many ways, it was like stepping into a heart beating with the sound of Empire of the Sun, Tiger Love, and MGMT. Everything was moving. People dancing, crowded amongst each other, moving like static on an old television. Everyone had a free face conveying emotions of euphoric joy or drunk sadness. It made me emotional knowing that so many destinies had been trapped in one room. This room forever lives in their memories. It is the room they refer to when telling kids their stories of youth. It is the room they escape to when adult reality feels too rough and merciless. It is the room that steals time. Whenever I found myself in Red Room, I had the strangest sensation of existence. It is in some ways such a non-place. The little furniture it had been gifted was old. Black leather couches, a wooden bar with velvet green stools, and absolutely nothing to tell time. I had a strange sensation of freedom. This room was anything I wanted it to be. It was any time I wanted it to be. It was not a room to discuss the worries of current news. It was not the promise of tomorrow. It was only the possibility of tonight, and I was young and inexperienced. All the secrets of the night were within my reach as I breathed deeply the sweet, intoxicating air and let my body be taken by the current of people. And while swallowed by the crowd, a hand found mine. It was an older girl I'd grown fond over, sweet, like an older sister, her hair big and wavy, her perfume sensual and floral. Her eyes green sparkled as she handed me a cup, and I drank it all, burning its way down my throat, and with a warm hand it opened up my chest. As I soaked in the sensation, I felt soft and vulnerable, with my heart exposed, lights of orange and purple in oxblood red. Thank you. Thank you. The next we're going to see is Marie Levin. Thank you.
The whale. So, draw a picture, she said softly. The first thing that comes into your head. Jesus wept, I thought, as I mentally rolled my eyes. I'm paying €60 for this. I sat motionless, opposite the lady with a soft voice and the lived-in face, a small table between us with a box of tissues for the crybabies. The rest of the room was empty, with the walls painted in dull neutral tones, but the windows went all the way to the ceiling and offered glimpses of the Shannon shimmering in the autumn sunshine. I thought about the water then, not the river, but the sea, the wild and wonderful stretch of coastline in Sligo that brings me solace on the dark days that often flood my mind. And with those thoughts, my pencil moved across the sketch pad, and in a few minutes I had drawn the rough outline of a beached whale. In August 2018, there had been a particularly high number of stranded whales along the west coasts of both Ireland and Scotland. Daily news bulletins reported that at least 38 Cuvier-beaked whales had turned up badly decomposed on various beaches, and several wildlife conservation groups were pointing the finger at the use of active sonar by military forces to locate submarines. I had followed the story closely, reading up on how sound travels well in deep waters, and the loud noises forced the whales from their natural habitat, 2 miles under the sea, to the surface too quickly, causing them to suffer decompression-like symptoms which killed them. Asking a few probing questions, the counsellor enabled me to join the dots and explain why I had drawn the whale. Wheelchair-bound following a horrific car crash 3 months earlier, I was left with no choice but to move back to my mother's house, some 30 years after I had left. The careless actions of humans had forced us both from our own environments into the unknown. As the realization hit me, I reached for the tissues I'd earlier dismissed, and the tears I had held back for so long flowed, as I wept for the whales and for myself and for all that we had lost.
Thank you, Marie. The next is Bridget McMurrow.
I'm going to read a poem called iPhone Default Alarm. I woke up on the wrong side of my life. Woke up in a mosh-style pit, bloody fingernails clawing my way to the surface, wishing I could breathe. I woke up still fighting, bloody knuckles, bloody knees, rolling it around my tongue, spat it from between my teeth. I woke up screaming, Woke up with most of my bones broken in the middle of resetting them. Woke up halfway through digging graves, a line of freshly closed plots with splinted wooden front doors for tombstones reading, "Here lies a bitch who would take it. Keep moving down, I'm running out of doors."
Thank you, Bridget. Next is Roisin O'Shea.
Antigone signs up to the DBC. Welcome to the Dead Brothers Club. Tonight is our Thursday social. We have all sorts here. Some of us are riddled with the guilt of the oldest, some with the anger of the baby left behind. This is Miriam, tea or coffee, who saved herself, but her brother drowned. Would you like a sandwich? Sarah's was born with her cord around his neck. She wonders if he would have looked like her. Or maybe a biscuit. They're over there where Agnes is sitting. She couldn't find him that night. Her family says he was murdered. She knows he tried before. And tell us about yourself. Are you from around here? Do you see the colour of his eyes in the clouds? Do you hear his voice in your dreams? Are you free every Thursday?
Thank you, Roisin. The next we're going to see is Tony Keenan.
Read poetry, unfortunately. I'm just here, and thanks to the Word for giving me the opportunity to speak for a moment about Scrimshaw. And Scrimshaw is the writing journal of the Atlantic Technological University. And I just wanted to speak here for a moment tonight to put out a shout out to all the lecturers, students and staff of ATU across all the campuses, Sligo, Galway and Letterkenny. And our flyer will be going out on the college social media any day now, but we're looking for submissions for the 2023 journal, which I'm part of the editorial team for, and our closing date for submissions is around about Christmas, just coming up. So to all the students, lecturers, staff and alumni of the ATU, please look out for our flyer, and if you like, email us at the Scrimshaw Journal at gmail.com and we'll answer any questions that you have. 2023 Scrimshaw. Thanks a million.
And that's nearly the end of our evening. I just want to say a big giant thank you to the two Niamhs who have just had the most amazing conversation, a real insight to the writing craft and the publishing industry. It was very interesting. And I just want to say thank you to Amy for providing the perfect music for the night as well. And for all those who took part in the open mic, some real good, real amazing talent coming up there. I would also like to thank Una Mannion from ATU Sligo for helping to coordinate this event and for all the events throughout the year, and to Studio Row for providing all their tech support. This is our final word for 2022, but we are already planning some exciting guests for 2023, so keep an eye on our social media platforms for details. Just before I go, I just want to say that next week is a Library Ireland Week, and we'll be celebrating here with libraries as a sanctuary. You're welcome to come in and chat to any of our library staff about our services and our online services. I just want to wish you all now a very happy and joyful Christmas and a peaceful New Year. And I want to invite Amy up to finish with the final song. So, Gur Míl Maigad Agus Slán Leat. Thanks.
Thank you for having me, Michelle, and thank you. This is a song called Alone But Not Lonely. Alone, alone, I'm a rock sitting on a hill. I've been thinking of you as I drink in the view, and my soul is peaceful and still. Alone, alone, I'm a cloud floating up above. I've been stung from behind too many times, and I'm not looking for love. 'Cause you won't understand my solitude, and you won't break my cozy shell. I'm happy here in my own company. We get along so well. Alone, alone, I'm a star hanging in the sky, and all I can do is hang around in blue and gently shine. Alone, alone, I'm a traveler on a dusty lane, with my life in a pack, slung on my back, and nobody knows my name. Alone, alone, I'm a leaf falling to the ground. I'll dance on the air to I don't know where, and disappear without a sound. 'Cause it's not that I am sad and lonely. It's not that I am on the shelf. I am happy here in my own company. We get along so well. Alone, alone, I'm a star hanging in the sky, and all I can do is hang around in blue and gently shine. Yes, all I can do is hang around in blue